most of the ancient civilizations, they had these grand structures. You know, Mesopotamia, Egypt. What did Indus Valley have? It had the Indra that's mentioned in the Rig Veda is a warrior, and he's fighting this dragon called Vritra. You know, it's a giant serpent and he's hiding behind like 99 fortresses. Indra destroyed those fortresses. So now when the Western Indologists, they were translating, they said, oh, because Indra is called destroyer of forts, this is probably referring to... So Saraswati is the most praised river in the Vedas. Ganga finds mention only 2 or 3 times. And that is again towards the more later part. That is probably when center of the civilization moved from Saraswati to the Ganga. Because you know, there was a seal which has a goddess surrounded by a tree, and there's a man with a bull bowing to her. It's very reminiscent of maybe... So a lot of people don't realize that Indra is not a person. Indra is a title. And when the stories are talking about different Indras, or stories about different Indras are about different people, it's not the same person. So, you know, some of the Indras may be more plotting in character, you know, they're politicians at the end of the day. It's a position that they are fighting for. You know, some of the Indras may be more warrior-like, some of the Indras may have been a little more you know, needing help, you know, so that's why they're always shown running to Brahma or Vishnu or Shiva, you know, for help. But the Indra that's mentioned in the Rig Veda is a warrior, you know, and he's fighting, he's leading the charge against this dragon called Vritra. And Vritrasur, he's also mentioned in the Bhagavad Puran, etc. So there's a whole story behind it. And so Vritra in the Vedas is described like a dragon, you know, it's a giant serpent who's coiled around the waters of the world, and you know, and is hiding behind like 99 fortresses. And Indra destroyed those fortresses, and he kills Vritra with his Vajra. So that gives rise to various epithets for Indra. You know, he's called the Purandar. So Purandar is someone who destroys forts. So now when the Western Indologists, they were translating, they said, oh, because Indra is called the destroyer of forts, this is probably referring to the Aryan invasion. You know, where the Aryans came in and destroyed the cities of Indus Valley Civilization. So that is how this entire concept, which is only stories, only theory, you know, all this was built up to delineate, you know, the Vedic thought from what could have been an indigenous Indian thought. But there's no such distinction in our scriptures. They don't mention coming from outside. There's no mention of any other rivers or regions outside of India. You know, all the stories are written in India. You know, all these Vedic verses were collected along the banks of the Saraswati and the Ganga and the Yamuna. You know, Saraswati is one of the major rivers. So since you mentioned Sindhu-Saraswati, you know, Indus-Saraswati. So Saraswati is the most talked about river in Rig Veda. Our Purans give the descriptions of the entire world, but they focus on Bharat. They focus on the land between the northern mountains and the southern sea. And they name it Bharat. You know, the land, Vishnu Puran also mentions that, you know, the land between the snowy mountains and the southern ocean is Bharat. And this is the Karma Bhumi. This is the land of karma. Had the civilization originated elsewhere, somewhere at least, you know, you would have got that mention. But none of our scriptures talk about that. So, coming back to, I think, the Sindhu-Saraswati civilization, you know, so Saraswati is the most praised, most eulogized river in the Vedas. And when you see historically, archaeologically, a majority of sites, Indus Valley sites, are along the banks of the Saraswati river bank. So a lot of people don't know, they're not bothered to even find out, you know, that Saraswati was actually a river. You know, it's not a mythical river. It did exist. In fact, a lot of Western scientists have done work on it. Unfortunately, you know, Indian scientists didn't. But, you know, writers, authors, and I always recommend books from Michel Denino and David Frawley. These are Indologists, Western Indologists who understand where India is coming from, you know, the civilizational background. A lot of Indologists, Western Indologists, they look at it from a very outsider's perspective. But both these authors, they look at it from a insider's perspective, as if they were Indian, they were living here. So I love their writing. And there is a lot of similarity in the things that you find in excavations in Indus Valley sites, like Dholavira, Lothal. There's so many seals that have the people tree leaf, and people Ashwath is one of the major trees in Vaishnava philosophy, where in Bhagavad Gita Krishna calls himself Ashwath. There's a unicorn which is there in the seals, in the Indus Valley seals. And Ekashringa is again another name of Krishna. So the bull, the Pashupati seal, there are seals that have goddesses, there are seals that have 7. So there's a very beautiful seal.
So can you expand this? I'm getting
Yeah.
a bit curious about this more.
Yeah.
So the seals,
Yeah.
and so far what I'm getting is that there is a link between the seals and the elemental aspects of the divine.
Yes.
In that civilization.
Yes.
So are we trying to indicate that that was one of the most realized civilizations that existed?
Most definitely. Definitely, because if you see, most of the ancient civilizations, they had these grand structures. Mesopotamia, Egypt, pyramids and all that. Mayas, Incas, all these, they were much later though. But they have these grand temples and citadels and all those. What did Indus Valley have? It had town planning. It had drainage systems. It had an advanced concept of vastu and positioning of buildings. It had massive granaries. It had massive bathhouses. So you see a focus on hygiene. You see a focus on it. It was
food production.
Food production. It was trading with Mesopotamia. It was trading with Egypt. It was trading. So there were ships. They were good navigators on the sea. So there's so much that comes from these excavations, even though the biggest drawback is that we have not been able to decipher the language or the script which was mentioned there. So that is one of the most contentious issues about Indus Saraswati civilization. But and I hope we are able to get a consensus, because a lot of people interpret it in different ways.
And then coming back to the seals that you were talking
about. So the
seals
are the ones that give us a picture of what could have been, the beliefs, I would say, not because the town planning, etc., shows us, it was an advanced civilization, because you do not find that level of town planning even today in most countries in the world, not just in India, but a civilization that had that level of town planning where, all the roads were at 90 degrees. They were, the houses were well built, airy, the windows were in the direction from which the wind would come, but not the dust would come. They had plumbing, they had water coming from the upper floors, the flushes, they had washrooms, they had flushes, not like, of course, a hand flush, but the concept of a flush that, the drain connects to the sewer, below, and all of it leads to a bigger drainage system and all that. So, and they had moats, etc., where they, of course, there would have been flooding, seasonal flooding and all that. They had prepared for that. So you see multiple levels of advancement in terms of technology, of urban planning. That can only happen in an urban or an advanced civilization, So seals tell us about the beliefs. They hint at the beliefs. For example, what I was saying was that, there was a seal which has a goddess surrounded by a tree, or she's coming out of a tree, something like that. That's how it appears. And there's a man with a bull bowing to her, and there is 7 females standing below it, and it's such a small seal, and you see all this happening there. Now it's very reminiscent of maybe Shiva bowing down to Shakti, and the 7 goddesses could be the Kritikas, the ladies who found Kartike. So there are concepts that can be drawn, that can be figured out, from these. Of Shivalinga has been found, in various excavations, the proper Shivalingam, So we do know that these existed. There are pits, which seem like the Yagna pits, that this is where fire would have been burnt, It may or may not have been religious in nature, but there's an indication that it could have been. So the weights were standardized across this, right from, say, Afghanistan, bordering Afghanistan, right up to UP, this entire civilization had standard weights. They had the standard big structure. So the concepts of Vastu, the concepts of architecture, the concepts of there has to be a language that they were using to communicate all these advanced concepts.
What was the period of time there, and with respect to the Yugas,
Right.
where does one see this Indus-Saraswati civilization come according to the Yugas? And like how many years back was it, and how does it link to the Yugas?
So see, the concept of Yugas is very complicated in the sense, it goes into hundreds and thousands of years. So even I have not been able to make sense of it completely in terms of the human history that we know today. So, but the Indus-Saraswati civilization, the oldest site is Bhirrana in Haryana. And that has been dated 9,500 years older, right, than today. So 9,500 or 10,000 years older than today, than where we are today. That was the extent of the civilization till date that we have found. So a lot of us don't know, what we are taught about Indus Valley civilization is Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, which are in Pakistan. Maybe at some point you would hear about Lothal in Gujarat being the biggest port and the oldest port. But the biggest Indus Valley site is in Haryana, and it is called Rakhi Gadi. The oldest site, as I mentioned, is called Bhirana or Bhirdana, again in Haryana. There are excavations that are happening in UP, the border, where, they have discovered chariots which are 4,500 years old. So till date, we were not, we were told that, chariots originated in Mesopotamia. And the whole concept of Aryan invasion was like, they came down in chariots and stuff. And, the people living here were more primitive and these guys were more advanced. But no, the Indus Valley cities show that these guys were not primitive. They were probably the most advanced of all ancient civilizations. And so in terms of yugas, I would say the scriptures talk about Kali Yuga beginning around 3102 BC. So scriptures don't give that time because they don't talk about AD and BC. This date was given by Aryabhat, who was one of the biggest scientists of ancient times. And he calculated, and it is corroborated.
So this is pre-Kali Yuga. Indus Valley is...
So Indus Valley civilization was at the cusp of, it was towards the ending of Dwapar, which is when the Mahabharata war happened, before Kali Yuga began, Okay. So some people theorize that, probably the civilization vanished because of the big, huge war that happened. May or may not be so. It is more likely that there were climatic changes. The Indus changed course, there was flooding, Saraswati disappeared, there was climatic changes happening all across the globe around 5,000 years ago, which probably resulted in the demise of that civilization. But this was somewhere around the Mahabharata time.
For it. Even these climatic changes, I mean, I guess I'm just speculating here because these climatic changes happen over so many years. Yes. It's not something that happens overnight.
Yes.
So there would have been a period of resilience, transformation, and then probably they would have migrated to other places.
Yes, yes. So that's exactly, what writers like David Frawley and Michel Derrino, they have done. What they have done is they have put together a sort of a probable history basis what the scriptures, the Hindu scriptures talk about, and what is the archaeological evidence that is available. So if you see, as I said, Saraswati is the most talked about river in the Rig Veda. Ganga finds mention only 2 or 3 times, and that is again towards the later part of the Vedas.
Oh, so that's when it's coming to life, probably.
Yes, that is probably when the center of the civilization moved from Saraswati to the Ganga. Because Saraswati dried up.